Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you are watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. I never expected a simple walk to the mailbox to change the way I looked at myself, or anyone else for that matter. It was one of those quiet afternoons when the air feels soft, as if it's carrying something unspoken. I remember I had just finished cleaning the kitchen, still wearing my old sweater with the loose threads at the sleeves. The neighborhood was still, except for a few leaves brushing across the pavement. I stepped outside with nothing more on my mind than collecting a stack of bills and maybe a few grocery flyers. As I walked down my driveway, I noticed my neighbor's son, Daniel, standing by his mailbox across the street. He's always been a polite young man, a little reserved, the kind who nods instead of starting conversations. But that day he looked different, thoughtful, almost troubled. He held a small envelope in his hand, like it weighed more than paper should. For a moment, I considered simply waving and going back inside, keeping everything simple and predictable. But something about the way he stood there, shoulders slightly tense, made me pause. He looked up and gave a quiet hi, the way he usually does, but his voice had a different edge to it. I walked closer, not wanting to startle him, and asked if he was doing all right. He hesitated, then admitted he wasn't sure. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Most people hide anything real behind excuses or a quick laugh, but he didn't. He simply told the truth. He said the letter he was holding was something he had been avoiding for weeks. I could see the corners of the envelope were worn from being handled too many times. I didn't pry, but he seemed relieved I didn't walk away. We stood there by our mailboxes, the sun warming the tops of our shoulders, a gentle breeze moving between us, carrying the faint smell of pine from the yard next door. He talked about feeling stuck, feeling like he was standing at the edge of something in his life and not sure how to move forward. He didn't go into details, and I didn't ask for them, but I listened. Sometimes listening is the most powerful thing you can offer someone. As he spoke, I found myself unexpectedly moved by how carefully he chose his words, and how deeply they seemed to sit inside him. I shared a little about myself too, not more than he offered, just enough to let him know that crossroads don't only happen to young people. I told him about a time, years ago, when I faced a decision that shaped the rest of my life, and how afraid I had been. He listened with the same attention I gave him, and in that moment, the air between us felt steady, supportive, almost warm. There was nothing dramatic happening. No shouting, no tears, no big revelation. But the quiet honesty of that moment felt heavier than anything loud or emotional could have. It was as if he had reached out for something solid, and I happened to be standing there when he needed it. And in return, without even realizing it, he reminded me of something I had forgotten about myself, that my own experiences still had value, that I still had something to offer this world, even in the smallest exchanges. We stood there longer than I expected, the soft shadows of the trees stretching across the street, the envelopes in our hands almost forgotten. When he finally took a deep breath and said he felt better, I could see it in his shoulders. Something had eased, not solved, but softened. And as he walked back toward his house, I found myself staring at the mailbox, thinking about how strange it is that the quietest moments are sometimes the ones that echo the longest. The world didn't change that afternoon, but something inside me did. Something subtle, something steady, something I didn't even know I needed. That night, long after the sun had slipped behind the houses and the streetlights cast their familiar warm glow, I found myself thinking about Daniel more than I expected. Not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet, reflective way you think about something that touched a part of you you'd forgotten existed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood settle into its evening stillness. It's funny how a simple conversation via mailbox can feel heavier in the silence of night, like the meaning of it continues to unfold. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes, not in him, but in myself. I walked a little slower, paid closer attention to the world around me, and felt more present than I had in a long time. I realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me the way he did that afternoon, truly listening, without rushing, without judgment. And I wondered if he felt the same shift inside himself. Late one afternoon, I was bringing in a few potted plants from the porch when I heard footsteps on the walkway. I turned and saw him standing there, hands in his pockets, the same thoughtful expression on his face, but with a hint of something lighter this time. He gave a small wave, and for a moment it felt as if we had both walked into a conversation we had been expecting without either of us saying so. He asked if I had a minute. His voice was calm, respectful, but there was something behind it, something sincere. I invited him onto the porch, and we sat on the steps while a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. It was one of those evenings where the sky turns that soft, muted blue right before dusk settles in. He told me the letter he'd been holding the other day was from a program he wanted to apply to. Something he'd dreamed about but never felt confident enough to pursue. He said he'd been carrying it around, waiting for the right moment to tell someone who might understand. His voice wasn't shaky, but I could tell the words were coming from a place that mattered to him. I listened, letting him speak at his own pace. He talked about fear, about pressure, about not wanting to disappoint anyone. And then, quietly, he said something that caught me off guard. He said talking to me at the mailbox had made him feel grounded, like he wasn't alone in trying to figure things out. He said there was something about my calmness, my honesty, that helped him breathe easier. I won't lie. Those words touched me more deeply than I expected. It had been years since anyone told me I made a difference. Life has a way of making you believe your value fades as time goes on, especially once your kids grow up and your routines become predictable. Hearing that from someone younger, someone who seemed to truly mean it, made something inside me warm in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I shared more with him too. Not advice, but pieces of my own experiences, the fears I carried at his age, the mistakes I made, and the things I learned the hard way. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He listened with that same focus he'd shown before, as if every word mattered. As the sky deepened into twilight and the first stars appeared, there was a comfortable quiet between us. It wasn't awkward or heavy. It was peaceful. Two people sitting on a porch, sharing a moment neither of us planned but both of us needed. Before he left, he hesitated slightly, then thanked me again for being someone he could talk to. He said he'd been feeling lost, and that our conversations made him feel like he had somewhere to stand while figuring out the next step. As I watched him walk back across the lawn, something settled inside me, a sense of renewal, a feeling I hadn't expected. It wasn't about him specifically. It was about being reminded that connection can appear in the most ordinary moments, and it can shift your thinking more than you realize. And when the porch light flickered softly above me, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something meaningful had begun, not dramatic or loud, but steady in a way that stays with you. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own breathing. I made coffee and stepped outside, letting the cool air settle against my skin. The neighborhood always looks different in the morning, lighter, calmer, as if everything is starting fresh. I found myself glancing toward Daniel's house without meaning to, wondering if he had made any decisions about that program he'd mentioned. I didn't expect to see him, but part of me hoped I might. Life, however, has its own timing. I didn't see him that day, or the next. 2 whole days passed, and even though I tried not to think about it, I caught myself worrying. Not in a dramatic or emotional way, just that quiet, steady concern you feel for someone who let you see a vulnerable part of themselves. When someone opens up like that, a small thread forms between you, whether you expect it or not. On the 3rd afternoon, when the sky was overcast and the air smelled like rain, I heard a soft knock at my door. It wasn't hurried, Not loud, just a polite tap that somehow carried a familiar rhythm. When I opened it, there he was. He looked tired but relieved to see me, his shoulders relaxing the moment our eyes met. He apologized for showing up without warning. I told him he didn't need to apologize. There was something gentle in his expression, something that made me step aside and invite him in without a second thought. We sat at the kitchen table, and the rain began tapping softly against the windows, filling the room with a calm, steady sound. He told me he had finally opened the letter fully and read it through. The program had accepted him, something he hadn't expected. He said he'd been scared to believe it, scared to think he deserved it, scared to consider how it might change his life. But more than that, he'd been scared he wouldn't have anyone to share the moment with. That part made me pause. He said he trusted me because he felt heard in a way he didn't often feel. And hearing him talk like that, so open and sincere, stirred something quiet inside me, something I thought I'd left behind years ago. Not a romantic feeling, not anything like that, but a deep sense of being seen, appreciated, respected. I told him how proud I was of him for facing something he feared. I told him that growth always asks us to step into places that feel uncertain. As I spoke, I could see something in him soften the way it had on the porch. Not weakness, but relief, like a person who finally feels understood. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, listening as the rain softened. He said talking to me helped him believe he wasn't trying to navigate everything alone. He said I gave him perspective he couldn't find anywhere else. And in that moment, the connection between us felt like two steady lines meeting at just the right point, not crossing boundaries, not creating confusion, but forming a shared understanding. I realized something then, something I hadn't admitted to myself before. These conversations weren't just helping him. They were helping me too. They reminded me of a part of myself I'd almost forgotten, the part that could guide, support, listen, and matter. Not because of age or experience, but because of presence. We sat there for nearly an hour, just talking through what the next steps might look like for him. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. Just genuine human conversation, the kind that fills the quiet spaces in your mind with a sense of purpose. Before he left, he stood by the doorway for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. He said the mailbox moment, our first real conversation, had changed more than just his mindset. He said it helped him see people differently, helped him trust again in a way he didn't know he could. When he walked out into the misty air, the rain easing into a soft drizzle, I realized something had shifted in me too. Not a sudden change, but a gentle realignment, a reminder that connection doesn't fade with age unless we let it. That being there for someone can awaken something steady inside us, something we didn't realize had gone quiet. And as I closed the door, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. There was still more to unfold, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, meaningful way that lingers long after the moment has passed. Over the next week, life settled into a quiet rhythm. The trees in the neighborhood began shifting into deeper shades, and the evenings grew cooler. I stayed busy with my usual routines, but every so often, I found myself thinking about how unusual it was for two people, living only a few steps apart, to form such an honest connection from something as ordinary as checking the mail. It made me look at life differently, how small moments carried more meaning than we often allow ourselves to notice. Then one afternoon, just as the sun was lowering and casting long gold lines across my living room floor, I saw him standing near the edge of my yard. He didn't come up right away. He hesitated, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like someone preparing themselves to say something important. I stepped outside, giving him space but showing him he was welcome. He walked toward me slowly, offering a quiet hello. There was something steady in his eyes, not troubled this time, but thoughtful, clear in a way I hadn't seen before. He told me he'd made his decision. He was going to accept the offer from the program. His voice didn't waver when he said it. Instead, it carried a calm certainty, like someone who had finally stepped through a doorway they'd been afraid to open. He thanked me, not in a rushed or polite way, but with a sincerity that stopped me for a moment. He said our conversations had helped him find clarity he hadn't been able to find anywhere else. Not advice, but understanding. He said feeling heard had made all the difference. I felt something warm settle in my chest when he said that. It had been so long since anyone had pointed to my presence, just my presence, as something meaningful. At my age, you start to feel like your role in the world becomes quieter, softer, less acknowledged. Hearing that I had mattered to someone reminded me that we never really stop having an impact unless we shut ourselves off. We walked a little, just down the path toward the end of my yard. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns across the sidewalk. He told me he was nervous, but hopeful. That he had doubted himself for so long, he never thought he'd feel ready for anything new. I told him that being nervous was a sign you're about to grow, not a sign you're failing. He smiled at that, really smiled, and the worry lines near his eyes eased. There was a quiet moment between us then, not heavy, not uncertain, just full. The kind of silence that feels like a natural pause in a conversation that doesn't need constant filling. I realized that what we had built wasn't something complicated. It wasn't confusing or difficult. It was simply two people recognizing something honest in each other. Before he left, he said something I'll never forget. He said he hoped the mailbox moment would stay with me as long as it would stay with him. Not because of anything dramatic, but because it reminded him, and me, that connection can happen anywhere when you least expect it. He walked back toward his house with lighter steps, and I stayed standing outside for a while, listening to the rustling of leaves overhead. The sky had deepened into the soft blues and pinks of early evening, and the air was cool but comforting. I felt a sense of peace, the kind that slips in quietly and settles somewhere deep inside. Later that evening, as I sat by the window with a warm cup of tea, I replayed everything in my mind. How a simple mailbox stop turned into something that shifted both our paths, even if only slightly. How opening up, even in small ways, can remind you of parts of yourself you thought had gone quiet. How sometimes offering someone a moment of understanding teaches you just as much about your own strength as it does about theirs. Life didn't change in a sweeping way after that day, but something inside me felt steadier, stronger. I felt more connected to the world around me, more open to the unexpected. And whenever I think back on it, I don't remember the bills or the flyers or the ordinary reasons we walked to our mailboxes that afternoon. I remember the moment something shifted, quietly, gently, meaningfully, and how it stayed with me long after the day turned to evening.